Hello everybody, welcome. Out for another night walk. I guess one of the central questions that we all face, and we mostly learn to solve it by developing layers of habits, is how do I tell what to do? Presuming that I should be doing something, of course. Or what's important? Now, that question, what's important, is a ridiculous catastrophe of generalization, because if we're asking that question by itself, depending on who's asking it, we're usually talking about root ideals. We're talking about fundamental principles of life as a human being, rather than how do I determine what's important right here, right now. Now, the language that I'll use is figurative. I don't mean it to be taken as I'm saying this is the case. But it's certainly as if we have an array of faculties that arise and depart and exchange dominance and so on. But the ones that I'm concerned with at the moment are those related to vigilance. What we're watching out for. And I'm particularly concerned with negative vigilance. However, positive vigilance is an astonishing transformation of consciousness for many of us. And those faculties aren't really my concern at the moment, profound and beautiful and important though they are. Particularly if they can be placed in precedence to the aspects, the faculties of mind that we use to detect threats. Dogs are profoundly vigilant in unusual ways, since they live with beings that are somewhat like gods to them. It's very important for them to figure out what's going on with the gods. They're right there in the room. And different dogs are vigilant in different ways, and cats are vigilant too. All animals are vigilant. So we have these faculties, and they're complex faculties. It's not just a single thing, though I could say I'm talking about our threat sentinel, the aspect of consciousness that watches over threats. Gets used in all kinds of different ways, certain ways when driving, other ways when walking. But in our day-to-day lives, we have threat sentinels that span the long story. Yeah? They see the whole span of our life, and they remember not only, actually they mostly remember when they saw a threat that came true. They don't remember their failures. They don't remember how many times they got it wrong. Those things don't get accounted in this, at least not consciously. So we have these vigilance faculties, and under stress, they warp and inflate and produce little amplifiers among the faculties in a single person, but also in any kind of a group. This is a natural feature of how humans are. They communicate about threats. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, usually both at the same time. And the indirection's hard to pay attention to because it can be quite sophisticated. So when we're stressed out, or frightened, or sick, or injured, or in a layered array of untenable situations, there's different ways we may respond, and each person may respond differently in different times, but there's a strong tendency for the threat sentinel faculties to become first inflamed and then to start producing something like feedback. And that's a cascading interplay of force between the faculties that amplifies it with each, iteration, each new pulse, so to speak. And strangely, if you look very closely at humans through this particular lens, you will certainly see some astonishing phenomena. If I were going to pick just one lens off the top of my head, here's where I'd go, to vigilance. When it warps under pressure, it produces a variety of emotional, metabolic, psychological effects that are very powerful and almost all quite negative. And when it gets inflamed, so to speak, and starts producing feedback, then we get forms of dysfunction that over time change the structure of our bodies and brains. Not irrevocably, but what usually happens, what happens very often, is that these processes, when they become dominant, they produce, how to put it, they harden the wires, right? They produce more of the same structure and embed it, not just in the brain or the body or the metabolism, but there too. But they embed it in the sort of layers that produce our waking consciousness. Yeah. It's embedded in there. And then it gets expanded and so on. Yeah. Even out for a walk, as I am, in the evening, vigilance is important. It's night. I'm walking down a dark street in a fairly dangerous neighborhood. And I see some people outside their car, 3 young men and a woman. And they're drinking. I am alone. Those 3 men can take me, right? It's not a joke. It doesn't even matter if I'm good. 3 of them and me, they can take me. Which means if they want, they can take what I have. And so, as I was speaking, my vigilance system not merely came online, right? It rose to the primordial fact of this moment of my experience. I have to evaluate this threat right now, while I'm doing something else. And I can't keep doing both things. I have to pay attention. So I'm walking off some of the adrenaline now. And look, I'm taking a risk by walking through this neighborhood by myself at night. And it's not just the risk of things I might predict to be a part of the situation. One has to include the risk of the unpredicted thing. One of my friends said that he'd spent many years trying to predict all the threats that were going to affect him and the world and all of the possibilities. But he didn't predict that driving down the freeway with his girlfriend, pipes would fall off a truck in front of them and bounce along the road and nearly kill them. It never occurred to him in all the right? That was the unpredictable one. And if we do the math reasonably, most of the predictive threats our Sentinels dream up or assemble from the seeming evidence. Most of them don't come true. The vast majority of them do not come true. And certainly there's some, at the root of all this, there's some primordial threat that's being distinguished into these little sentinels and their detective work. Yeah, they think of themselves. No, they don't think of themselves. They're a bit like detectives, right? They piece together evidence, so to speak. Except a lot of the times it isn't evidence, or it's evidence of absence. They piece together absences and all kinds of peculiar behavior. And they also produce accurate, dependable results that save us from harm when they're working well. The whole cultural and sociocultural situation at the moment can be usefully encompassed with this lens of vigilance and how the humans in essentially fictional relationships and situations, particularly if money is a fiction, their vigilance is being both dangerously amplified sort of arbitrarily, and then not perfectly intentionally, but para-intentionally manipulated directly. And then they are manipulating it themselves without knowing that, or just don't have this lens through which to look at that behavior. So you can see these sort of pulses of amplified, warped vigilance, layers of these pulses of this going off in the sociocultural networks and relationships. Especially the more superficial, the more this is happening and the more that most of the input is not reliable. to be kind. In fact, this form of intelligence itself is not reliable, except in a very narrow, effective scope. And when it becomes inflamed or amplified, our minds and our social coherence collapse. It's very expensive to amplify the Sentinels, but that's not the only reason they collapse. It's a complex array of related features that link together so that if one of them goes sideways, there's some corrective intelligence from the others, but if three of them go sideways, the thing mostly just breaks down and starts self-stimulating at ever higher rates, right? So in the grocery store, in the kind of dangerous place where I am, I had a transaction with a woman at the checkout counter. So I did a bunch of predicting, and I predicted that probably people are fairly rude to her pretty commonly. And so rather than look at her impatiently, which I could cast an impatient glance in her direction, I just waited calmly until she finished the couple things she was doing while there was a brief moment of, pause in the customers. But in order to succeed at that task involved some of my vigilance faculties. Yeah? In other words, I was paying attention. I had some idea for a brief moment of what was important, and I could attend it as best I could, but at least with some awareness that it was important. Lots of times, my vigilance has saved my life, especially driving, and maybe the lives of other people. However, when it gets warped by stress, it produces unreliable theories. I could give you an example, but I'm hesitant to. Let's see how I can transform it. So there's a guy that works in a factory, and they have some chemicals in the factory, and he hears about a chemical that will have a very bad effect on you if it gets on your skin, and you won't even notice it. Right? The problem here is that you won't even notice it is almost a hypnotic command. So he hears about this, and later that day he finds some substance. He opens a can and something splashes on him, and he can't figure out what's in the can, so he thinks that it must be this very dangerous chemical he heard about. That's his first thought. His vigilance sentinel has been what's the right word? Well, it's deceived itself, but it took a wrong branch. It took the wrong branch on an array of possibilities, and it took that because it's the most dangerous one. The scariest one, especially the one that can't be survived or something like this, right? Or it can't be fixed, or it can't be transcended. We're just trapped in this terrible fate of some kind. Yeah. These ones, these are the bad ones. These underlie all of their little derivative sub-progeny. So vigilance and the faculties involved with it are aspects of our intelligence. But they can, just like our societies can be, can become habitually misguided, so too these features can become habitually misguided and set up a pretty miserable life, and certainly a very difficult mind. And they leak into our relationships, and people form vigilance amplifiers between them, and they negotiate over whose vigilance is valid and whose isn't. All of this swarming chaos of vigilant interplays. Yeah. The gravity of ambiguity, not knowing what's going on, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing if you're okay or you're not okay or you're somewhere in between or there's 7 other things going on, right? All of these things form a field in which our vigilance tries to calibrate. It's really attempting to calibrate. Same issue. Another human in the night, in the dangerous neighborhood. So you see, as I'm reflecting on vigilance, because of the situation I'm in, I have to, at the same time, experience it. Right? A state of heightened vigilance where there's a palpable threat or a number of palpable threats. And of course, threats have temporalities. They're either right here, right now, someday, sometime, next week at 4, right? They have temporalizations. So the vigilance faculties are also aware of time pressure. You know, it's not just whether we have to pay attention or not. When do we have to pay attention? Can we tell when we have to pay attention? All of these things. So for most of us at this point in modern history and the pandemic and disinformation waves and so on, the internet, etc., etc., we are disoriented, and most of our threat sentinels are overworked, warping under the pressure and producing all kinds of static and, you know, figurations, ghosts. So we become disoriented in vigilance. And we can't tell even what should we really pay attention to, and why, and how. And usually, if there's to be any reasonable medicine for this, it's going to be something about, we might have to manage where and how we invest our attention first to just recover some balance and space, terrain. Many of our mental illnesses deeply involve, not all of them probably, but some interesting ones, certainly autism, Asperger's, schizophrenia, most forms of psychosis, many forms of psychosis. All these things deeply involve vigilance, and schizophrenia is probably the best of the examples. What is being paid attention to? Why is it being paid attention to? So if the fundamental principles around which our vigilance organizes its faculties, if those get any way warped, so to speak, in this toy of things, the rest of the faculties, the light they shine is half inventing what is seen, right? And so that's where the feedback comes from. The aspects of consciousness that organize around a threat that's perceived as probable or possible, and with schizophrenics, possible quickly becomes probable, quickly becomes likely, quickly becomes fact. Right? It's a very slippery slope for many of them, particularly if they're paranoid. Not necessarily clinically, but this term itself encompasses misfunction of threat sentinels. It's a vigilance problem. The wrong things are being paid attention to and amplified in consciousness: fear, freeze flight, sort of almost limbic level results ensue. Of course, there's even an aspect of vigilance that's watching over my talk right now. Am I able to actually bring my points forth, my vision forth, my ideas into the light so that others will understand them or be able to make use of them or be healed by them, or make discoveries of their own, opposing them even. So yeah, something's watching over the quality of my presentation. Even while I'm facing potentially life-threatening situations on the street at night in the strange place I am. And the problem with potentially life-threatening situations is you can't tell they're not life-threatening. And if the Sentinels are just slightly over-amplified or miscued, poorly primed, they do all kinds of things. If the mind, I think the mind is a transformation of dreaming, actually. I often think this. If it is, when it turns to these particular features, it loses its coherence and begins to look like a reflection of the wildly confusing and dysfunctional sociocultural contexts and situations and transmissions and such that we are swimming in. Oh my. The topic may be too deep for me to explore it effectively. Perhaps I'm just introducing it here. But I suspect if you follow the thread, you will see how almost all conflicts, fears, and suffering come from this one cohort of faculties. yeah, the vigilance faculties, all of the suffering. We're making predictions of threat and opportunity. We're very enmeshed in the threats. The opportunities are not quite as compelling. And so there are styles of vigilance, sort of with a middle case V, not quite a capital V, not a little v, middle case. There are styles of vigilance and vigilance over vigilance that don't produce feedback. They buffer vigilance. And ordinarily, when we're not stressed, this is what's going on, right? There's a buffer between vigilance and consciousness. And when that buffer starts to erode under stress, or the vigilance underneath becomes very bubbly and multi-layered, it breaks through into consciousness. And then usually some kind of feedback-like event, or series of them, or couplet, doublet, triplet of them arise. And then there's feedback inside those. Little amplifiers in a way. One of the drivers of the process is that there's a cost to the continuing failure to collapse ambiguity into something graspable. And when multi-ambiguity, because we're never in just one kind of ambiguity, is constant, things are very unpredictable or far less predictable than usual. Our predictions fail. We go to the store, there's no toilet paper there. It's a very first world version of, then one thing that can happen is that the vigilance faculties start play collapsing the ambiguity into its worst possible outcomes. You see? This is the thing to see here. This thing. They start imagining the ambiguity falling out in the worst possible way, or a number of them. This further inflames the faculties that are doing this, so it becomes a self-amplifying loop. I know this both from studying it in people that I am with, and also in looking inside myself and seeing, yes, here are these little faculties. They are senses, but they are easily dominated if we are unaware of their vulnerability, and once the buffer is worn away for us. And that can happen instantly, or it can happen over time, and sometimes the buffer is restored and things go back to some semblance of synchronization, working harmoniously. With extreme irony, I have to admit that it was vigilance, a type of vigilance, that invoked this entire line of concern for me. I was watching over the processes of my mind from a position a little bit above them or outside them. And then I was thinking over, some things that I have seen happening among people that I know. And then it hit me like a gigantic insight. Oh, my. There's a vigilance issue at the root of all of these things. An array of vigilance issues, a library of them, but yeah, it's a vigilance problem. Now, of course, that's just one lens. It's the lens I'm selecting this evening. We want to believe that someone trustworthy and good is watching over us. And will step in if there's a crisis or trouble, rescue us. Many of us do. Some are more pragmatic and therefore have an even heavier vigilance weight because they know that no one is going to step in and save them. Therefore, their vigilance quota is quite extreme when it's extreme. There is much more to say when I am home. And so the context of my vigilance will change. In every place we go, different forms of vigilance arise. Shopping is a form of vigilance. One of the deepest topics we could possibly approach will certainly not encompass it here. But thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning again together soon.